The journal hit the sheriff's desk with a sound like a gunshot, and Sadie Barrett's whole world stopped breathing. She stood in the doorway of the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office, her chest heaving, her dark hair tumbling loose from its pins, and she watched Amos Easton slowly rise from behind that desk with her most private, most sacred, most devastating secrets held open in his hands. The late afternoon sun slanted through the single dusty window and caught the gold of his sheriff's badge, and she thought, in that fractured and terrible moment, that she had never hated anything more in her life than she hated that gleaming piece of metal right now. "You read it," she whispered. Her voice came out wrong, broken at the edges, like glass that had been cracked but not yet shattered. Amos did not look away. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of dark river water and a jaw that could have been carved from the red rock canyons that surrounded this godforsaken town. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to protect, even if she could not see that yet, even if all she could see was the betrayal. "Sadie," he said. "Do not," she said. "Do not say my name like that. Do not say my name like you know me. You do not know me. Nobody in this town knows me, and I intended to keep it that way." I wrote back. Those two words landed like a second gunshot, and they were worse than the first. She crossed the room in 4 long strides, snatched the journal from his hands, and opened it. There, in her cramped, urgent, fearful handwriting, were months of her hidden life. The grief over her mother's death back in Missouri. The terror of what her late husband's brother, Victor Crane, intended to do with her land. The confession that she had not cried once since she arrived in Redemption Creek because she was afraid that if she started she would never stop. And then, below her words in a different hand, strong and careful and measured, were his responses, his confessions. His voice speaking back to her from inside the pages of the thing she had believed was hers alone. She stared at those pages, and the anger wavered, and something far more dangerous crept in underneath it. 3 months earlier, Sadie Barrett had arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, on a Wednesday in early April of 1882, with a single trunk, a bad reputation she had not earned, and a land deed that a very powerful man wanted to take from her by any means necessary. She had not planned to stay long. She had planned to file the deed with the county land office in Redemption Creek, which was the nearest town to the property. Her husband Calvin Barrett had left her when fever took him the previous winter, and then she had planned to sell the land to someone respectable and use the money to get herself somewhere far away from Texas, far away from Victor Crane, and far away from every single person who looked at her with that particular blend of suspicion and pity that widows in the West were subjected to as a matter of routine. What she had not planned for was the land office clerk informing her, with a kind of gleeful bureaucratic regret, that there was a dispute on the deed, that a competing claim had been filed, that until the matter was resolved by the county circuit judge, who would not arrive in Redemption Creek for another 3 months, she could not sell the property, could not leave the county, and was effectively trapped. Victor Crane had filed the competing claim. Of course he had. Calvin's older brother, a man with shoulders like an ox and a smile like a trap snapping shut, had made it very clear after Calvin's funeral that he considered Sadie an interloper, a woman of insufficient standing who had wormed her way into his family's legacy. The fact that Calvin had loved her fiercely and left her everything was, in Victor's interpretation, evidence of his brother's weakness rather than evidence of his devotion. Sadie had left Missouri 1 step ahead of Victor's lawyers and 1 step ahead of his hired men, and she had arrived in Redemption Creek with the deed tucked inside her corset and her jaw set hard as iron, and she had told herself she was not afraid. The journal had been her mother's idea, or rather it had been her mother's habit passed down to her. Margaret Barrett, née Sullivan, had kept a journal her entire adult life, filling volume after volume with her fears and her joys and her prayers and her small daily observations. And when she died of pneumonia the previous autumn, Just weeks before Calvin succumbed to the same fever that had been ravaging the Missouri Valley that year, she had left Sadie the current volume, half filled, with a note tucked inside that read, "The page will hold what you cannot say aloud. Trust it." Sadie had started writing the night she arrived in Redemption Creek, sitting on the narrow bed in the room she rented above the mercantile owned by a widow named Clara Hofstede, who was kind in a brisk and practical way and asked no questions, which Sadie appreciated enormously. She wrote about being 26 years old and entirely alone in a way she had not expected to be alone. She wrote about Calvin, about how she had genuinely loved him even though their marriage had been practical at its origin. A Missouri schoolteacher of modest means marrying a Texas rancher of modest prospects, two people who recognized in each other a similar quality of steadiness. She wrote about how his death had unmade something inside her that she was not sure she could rebuild. She wrote about Victor Crane, about the cold purpose in his eyes and the very real danger she believed herself to be in. She wrote about the land, about the 300 acres of rough Texas grassland that Calvin had sweated and sacrificed for, and that she owed it to him to protect. She wrote about the fact that she could not afford to break, not here, not in this town full of strangers, not with a powerful enemy already moving against her. She wrote it all in that journal, night after night, and then she tucked it under the loose floorboard beneath her bed, and she went out into the world of Redemption Creek every morning wearing the face of a composed and capable widow who was handling her affairs with perfect efficiency. The journal fell out of her trunk when she was moving it to retrieve a letter she needed for the land office, and it landed open in the corridor outside her room, and she was already late for an appointment, and she told herself she would retrieve it when she returned, and when she returned it was gone. She had assumed the worst. She had torn the room apart looking for it. She had barely slept for 2 nights, her mind running wild with every possible person who could have found it, and what they could do with what was written inside it. It was Clara Hofstede who told her, with a look of careful neutrality on her face, that she had seen Sheriff Easton come up the stairs the morning the journal went missing, that he had been there to deliver a notice to Sadie regarding the land dispute, and that he had been carrying something when he went back downstairs. Sadie had walked to the sheriff's office with every intention of being coldly, masterfully furious. She had not expected him to have written back. She stood in the middle of his office now, the journal open in her hands, and she read what he had written. Not quickly, not skimmingly, but the way you read something that has been addressed directly to you, the way you read something that demands your full attention because it is offering you something you did not know you needed. He had written to the entry about Calvin first. He had written, "A man who was genuinely loved is not lost. He lives in the way you describe him, in the specific weight of your grief, which is not a small and generic grief, but a large and precise one that knows exactly what it is missing. I am sorry for it." She felt her throat close. He had written to the entry about her loneliness. "This town looks harsh from the outside. Most people who come here in trouble see only the hardness of it, but there are people here worth knowing, if you allow it. I say this not to minimize what you are carrying, but to remind you that you are not required to carry it entirely alone." She looked up from the journal. Amos Easton was watching her from behind his desk, his hat off, his dark hair a little disheveled, looking somehow simultaneously like the most imposing and the most careful person she had ever encountered. "Why?" she said. "Because I found it open," he said. "And I could not help but read a line, and then I could not stop. And I know that was wrong, Sadie. I knew it when I was doing it. But what you wrote inside that book deserved to be answered, and there was nobody answering it, and I could not leave it unanswered." "That is not a justification," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is an explanation. They are not the same thing. I am not trying to justify it. I am trying to be honest with you about it." She looked back down at the journal. She read one more entry, his response to what she had written about Victor Crane. He had written, "I know Victor Crane. He has business interests throughout this county, and he uses the law like a tool when it suits him and discards it when it does not. What you are afraid of is real. I want you to know that I see it and I do not dismiss it. And I want you to know that while you are in this county, while this dispute is pending, nothing will happen to you that I can prevent." She closed the journal. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had invaded the most private fortress of her inner life and left gifts inside it, this man who had read her secrets and responded not with judgment or gossip or manipulation, but with a kind of grave, steady care that she had not encountered from another human being in what felt like a very long time. "You had no right," she said. "No," he said, "but you wrote back anyway." "Yes." She pressed the journal to her chest the same way she might press a wound. "I am going to go back to my room now," she said, "and I am going to decide what I think about this, and you are going to wait." "I can do that," Amos said. She walked out. The April wind hit her in the face the moment she stepped onto the main street of Redemption Creek, and it tasted of dust and distance and the particular wild freedom of the Texas plain, and she pressed the journal harder against her chest and walked, and she did not look back. But she was thinking about his handwriting. It was nothing like what she had expected from a lawman. It was measured and precise and occasionally, surprisingly, almost gentle. She did not throw the journal away. That night, sitting at the small table in her rented room with the lamp burning low and the sounds of the saloon 2 streets over drifting through the window, Sadie opened the journal to a fresh page and she wrote. She wrote about finding out he had read it. She wrote about the fury she had felt and the complicated, unwanted thing that had come underneath the fury. She wrote about the fact that she did not trust easily, that she had good reasons for that the last year of her life had consisted almost entirely of loss and threat, and the necessity of being alone in her decisions. She wrote about the fact that his words had nonetheless reached her, that the entry about Calvin had made her cry for the first time since she had arrived in Redemption Creek, which she supposed meant that he had been right about the crying being necessary. She wrote it all. And then, at the very bottom of the page, in letters that were smaller and more careful than the rest, she wrote, "I do not know what to do with someone who is kind without an obvious motive. I have forgotten what that looks like." She pressed the book closed and went asleep. In the morning, she left the journal on the front windowsill of the sheriff's office before the sun was fully up, and she walked quickly away before anyone could see her do it. Amos Easton arrived at his office at 6 in the morning, as was his habit, and found the journal on the windowsill, and he brought it inside and sat down at his desk and read what she had written. He sat with it for a long time before he picked up his pen. He had been the sheriff of Redemption Creek for 4 years, having come to the position after a decade spent doing various harder and darker things across the territory that he did not particularly enjoy discussing. He was not from Texas originally. He was from Kentucky, born and raised in a small mountain community that had been destroyed by the war when he was 12, and he had spent the subsequent 20 years making his way across a country that was also, in its own fashion, trying to figure out what it was supposed to be in the aftermath of enormous violence. He had found in the law real law, not the corrupt and performative kind, but the actual day-to-day work of keeping a community safe enough to function, something that felt close to a purpose. It was not perfect. Nothing in this life was perfect. But it was real, and it was his, and he had built something in Redemption Creek that he was genuinely proud of. He had not been in love for a long time. He had been close once with a woman in Abilene named Margaret Holt, but it had not worked out because she had wanted someone who would leave the law behind and settle into a quieter life, and he had not been able to do that. Not then, and they had parted without bitterness, but with a specific sadness that he still felt sometimes on quiet evenings. He had not expected Sadie Barrett. He wrote back to her entry about not trusting. He wrote, "Kindness without an obvious motive is not as rare as you believe. It is only that the motives you have been surrounded by recently have been obvious and ugly, and it has recalibrated what you expect from people. This is survivorship. It is not a character flaw. It is your mind doing its job. But I want to tell you, for what it is worth from someone who is still mostly a stranger to you, that there are some things I want and some things I do not want. And one thing I want very much right now is for you to not have to be afraid anymore. That is the whole of my motive. I cannot make it simpler than that. He left the journal on the windowsill again before she was likely to be up, and he went to do his rounds of the town. This became, over the following weeks, a kind of ritual. The journal passed between them, back and forth, through the window of the sheriff's office or left on the step of the mercantile, always before the town was fully awake, always without them having to acknowledge in the full daylight what they were building in those quiet pages. They were building something private and true inside the journal, while they were also building something careful and public in the town itself, encountering each other in the general store and at the Sunday church service, and at the community supper, the ladies' auxiliary put on the first Thursday of every month, and being politely, warmly, carefully acquainted with each other in the eyes of Redemption Creek. Sadie began to know the town. She had not meant to know it. She had meant to stay remote and temporary and untouched by the place, but Clara Hofstede had a way of introducing her to people that made refusal seem churlish, and before she fully understood what was happening she knew the blacksmith, a man named Ezra Poole who had fought in the war and had a laugh that could shake the rafters, and the doctor, a young woman named Dr. Helen Marsh who had come out from Philadelphia the year before and was still visibly astonished by the scope of what she was being asked to treat, and the preacher, a man named Reverend Dade who was very old and very wise and who had a habit of saying things that sounded simple until you thought about them properly. And she knew Amos. She knew him first through his handwriting and his words, and then she knew him in the way you know someone you watch without quite meaning to. She knew that he took his coffee without sugar, and that he always tipped his hat to Mrs. Poole, and that he had a way of standing very still when something troubled him, as though stillness was his version of thinking it through. She knew that he was scrupulously fair, that when a dispute between two ranchers over a fence line threatened to turn ugly, he had resolved it with such patient thoroughness that both men left the sheriff's office annoyed but respecting the outcome. She knew that he was not cruel, not even privately, not even in small ways, which she had come to understand was not as common a quality as it should have been. The journal entries between them deepened. He told her about Kentucky, about the mountains and the war and the specific kind of homesickness you feel for a place that no longer exists in the form you knew it. She told him about her parents, about her father who had been a schoolteacher before her, and had taught her that words were the most powerful tools available to a person who lacked physical force. She told him about the years when she had been a schoolteacher herself, before Calvin, in a small Missouri town where the children were bright and hungry for learning, and the school board was entirely unconcerned with funding the institution they nominally administered. She told him about the morning Calvin proposed to her, how it had been in February with snow on the ground, and how he had been so nervous he had gotten down on one knee in the mud outside the general store, and presented her with a ring that was very clearly from the glass display case inside the store that he had not yet paid for, and how she had said yes anyway, and how he had carried the ring back inside and paid for it with such transparent relief that the store owner had given them $1 off the price as a wedding present. She was laughing when she wrote it, and the writing showed it, the letters uneven and energetic, and she had not expected to be laughing about Calvin yet, and it felt like something loosening in her chest, like a knot she had not known was there beginning to release. Amos wrote back, "I can picture that clearly. He sounds like someone who was genuinely himself, without pretense, and people like that are worth grieving properly." May turned to June, and the Texas heat arrived in earnest, the kind of heat that turns the town into a shimmer of reflected light, and makes the horses stand with their heads down in the shade, and makes every conversation a little shorter, because nobody wants to expend the energy. Victor Crane arrived in Redemption Creek on the 3rd of June, 1882, on a black horse with silver tack, and with 2 men riding behind him who wore guns in the low-slung way that says these are not ranching men. These are not ordinary men. These are men hired for a purpose that has nothing to do with cattle. Sadie was in the mercantile when she heard his voice outside on the street, and every nerve in her body went cold despite the heat. She had not seen Victor since the morning after Calvin's funeral, when he had come to the house and told her in very quiet and very civilized terms that her continued presence in Missouri was an affront to the family legacy, and that she should consider selling the deed and removing herself. And she had told him, in equally quiet terms, that she would do exactly as she chose and that he could go to hell. She set down the bolt of cotton she had been examining, and she walked to the mercantile window, and she watched Victor Crane ride down the main street of Redemption Creek as though he owned it and everything in it, and she felt the old fear move through her, the cold animal fear that had been her constant companion for the past several months, but underneath it she felt something else now. Anger, clean and clarifying. She had written in the journal the night before, in one of those moments of strange courage that came on her sometimes in the small hours, "I am so tired of being afraid. I have been afraid for so long that I have begun to wonder if I even remember what it felt like not to be. But I think I do. I think it felt like having enough room inside myself to breathe." She left the mercantile and she went directly to the sheriff's office. Amos was already at the window watching Crane ride in. He had that particular stillness on him that she had come to recognize as him thinking through something dangerous. "He is here," she said from the doorway. "I see him," Amos said. "He has hired men. I see them too." He turned to look at her then, and the look on his face was the look from the journal entries made visible, that particular quality of gravity and care that she had been reading in his handwriting for weeks and was now, in the full light of a June afternoon, being aimed at her directly. "Are you all right?" "I am frightened," she said, because she had decided some weeks ago that she would not lie to this man, at least not about the important things. "But I am also very angry, and I have found that the anger is useful." "Good," Amos said. "Hold on to the anger. I am going to go talk to Victor Crane, and you are going to go back to your room and stay there until I come and tell you it is handled. I am not a child to be sent to her room." "No," he said. "You are an intelligent woman who is the central party in a legal dispute, and if Crane can provoke you into saying something in public that he can use against you, he will. The best thing you can do for your case and for yourself right now is to be completely unavailable. Let me handle this part." She held his gaze for a moment. This was the thing about Amos Easton that she had been wrestling with in the journal and had not yet resolved, the fact that he had a habit of being right that was simultaneously reassuring and intensely irritating. "Fine," she said, "but you will tell me everything." "Every word," he promised. She went back to her room. She opened the journal and she wrote, to have something to do with her hands and her racing mind, while downstairs in the street of Redemption Creek, the sheriff of the county walked directly up to Victor Crane's horse and said, in a voice that carried just enough to be clearly heard, "Mr. Crane, I understand you have business in this county. I would like you to understand that this is my county and that any business conducted here will be conducted according to its laws." Victor Crane looked down from his horse with the particular expression of a man who has bought and sold many sheriffs in many counties and is already calculating whether this one will be similarly manageable. He said, "I am here entirely within the law, Sheriff. I have a legal claim pending before the county court." "That is correct," Amos said. "You do. And it will be heard by Judge Calloway when he arrives in August, and until then the status quo will be maintained. The Barrett deed stands as filed. The Barrett property remains inviolate. And the woman who holds that deed is a citizen of this county and is under the protection of this office. I want to make sure those things are very clear before we proceed any further." Victor Crane smiled. It was a thin smile, the smile of a man who has not yet decided whether to take a threat seriously. Perfectly clear, Sheriff. My men and I are just passing through to see the property itself. Surely there is no law against a man looking at land he believes is rightfully his." "There is no law against it," Amos agreed. "But it will be done in my presence, and it will be done by you alone. Your hired men will be welcome at the saloon on my word, which will ensure they are treated well, but they will not be riding out to the Barrett property. That is a condition of your being welcomed in this town rather than asked to move along." There was a pause. Victor Crane looked at the sheriff with that calculating expression, taking the measure of him, deciding. And then, because he was also a practical man who understood that a flagrant confrontation this early would not serve his legal case, he nodded. "As you wish, Sheriff," he said. Amos went with Victor Crane to the Barrett property that afternoon. He wrote about it to Sadie the next morning in the journal, a detailed and methodical account of what he had observed. The land was good land, he wrote, better than he had understood from the deed description. There was a creek running through the eastern third of it, and the grass was thick and the soil looked rich. He understood now more fully why Victor Crane wanted it. He also wrote, "Your husband had a good eye for land. Whatever else the past year has taken from you, it has not taken this. It is worth fighting for." Sadie read that and felt the determination settle into her bones like iron. Victor Crane took a room at the town's only hotel, and his men set up camp outside of town, and the tension in Redemption Creek acquired a new and uncomfortable texture. People knew there was a dispute. People knew the newcomer with the expensive horse and the hired guns was on one side of it, and the quiet widow from Missouri was on the other. They had opinions, as small towns always do, and the opinions were divided, because Victor Crane was the kind of man who knew how to present himself to a community, and had spent his first few days in town being charming and generous, and positioning himself as the aggrieved party, the man robbed of his family's legacy by a woman who had only been a Barrett for 3 years. Sadie heard the whispers. She held her head up and she did not respond to them, because responding to whispers in a small town was the surest way to give them legs, and she spent the afternoons of that difficult June organizing what she had to present to Judge Calloway. She had Calvin's will. She had the deed. She had letters Calvin had written to her during the early part of their marriage, when he had been in Texas on the ranch, and she had been finishing her last term of teaching in Missouri. Letters in which he spoke of the land with a possessiveness that was both territorial and deeply affectionate. Letters in which he called it hers as much as his because they were one enterprise, one life. She organized all of this into a leather document case, and she sat with Amos in the evenings, at the sheriff's office after his deputy had gone home, going through it with him, because he had been the law in this county long enough to understand what Judge Calloway would find compelling and what he would dismiss, and his guidance was sharp and practical and invaluable. These evenings became something she looked forward to with a warmth that she had stopped trying to pretend was purely professional. They sat across from each other at his desk, with the lamp between them and the documents spread out, and they talked about the case. And then, inevitably, they talked about other things, and the conversation moved with the ease of people who already know each other very well through a medium that strips away pretense and leaves only the truth of the person. One evening in late June, he looked at her across the lamp and said, "You are the most honestly written person I have ever encountered." She looked up from the letter she was reviewing. "What do you mean?" "In the journal," he said, "most people, when they are writing for themselves, are still performing for some imagined audience. But you write exactly what you mean. There is no artifice in it. It is just you exactly." She felt the color come up in her face, and she was annoyed at herself for it, and she hoped the lamp made it impossible to tell. "That is because it was supposed to be private," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why it is so rare." She put the letter down and looked at him squarely. "Amos," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name directly to his face, and they both noticed it. "What is this? What are we doing? Because I am standing in a very complicated situation, and I do not have room for something I cannot name." He held her gaze with complete steadiness. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "That is what this is. I am aware of the timing and the complications. I'm not asking you to do anything about it right now. But I think you deserve an honest answer to an honest question, so there it is." Sadie Barrett had not expected to feel relief. She had expected to feel alarm, or at minimum a cautious pulling back, a self-protective instinct. Instead, what moved through her was something very close to relief, as though a thing she had been braced for had arrived at last and turned out to be survivable. "I am not," she said carefully, unaffected. Amos allowed himself a very small smile, the kind of smile that is made mostly in the eyes. "I will take that," he said. They went back to the documents. But the air in the room was different, and the lamp seemed warmer, and Sadie caught herself looking at his hands as he turned the pages. His careful, strong sheriff's hands, and she thought about the handwriting those hands had made in her journal. And she pressed the thought down carefully because there were still 2 months until the judge arrived, and a very powerful and dangerous man currently sleeping 2 streets away who intended to take everything from her. The journal still passed between them, but it was different now. They both knew what they were writing toward, and the entries became at once more careful and more open, a paradox that seemed to define everything about what they were building. Sadie wrote, "One night in July when a summer storm was beating at the window and the thunder was rolling in from the west like a slow and enormous drum, I did not come here to find this. I came here to solve a problem and leave. But I find that I have become, without meaning to, attached to this town, to the people in it, to the conversations at your desk in the evenings, to the things you write. I am trying to decide whether what I feel is real or whether it is the product of fear and isolation and the particular intimacy of a shared crisis, and I cannot tell. How does a person tell the difference?" He wrote back the next morning, "I have asked myself the same question many times because I do not want to be fooled by my own heart any more than you do. Here is what I have decided. What you feel in the journal when you write about me is not the same feeling as what you write about the crisis. The crisis makes you feel smaller. What we have built here in these pages between us makes you feel larger. That is not the same thing. That is not proximity and gratitude confusing themselves into something false. That is something real." She read that on a Tuesday morning in the middle of July, sitting in her rented room above the Mercantile, and she pressed her hand flat over the page and she let herself, for the first time in a very long time, believe that something good was actually possible. Then Victor Crane made his move, and everything nearly came apart. It was a Wednesday, 3 weeks before Judge Calloway was due to arrive. Sadie went to retrieve a document from the land office, and was told that the document had been filed incorrectly and would need to be resubmitted with an additional declaration of residency, a declaration that required 2 witnesses who had known her in her previous county of residence for more than 1 year. The clerk, a weasel-faced man named Purvis who had been in Victor Crane's pocket for at least as long as Crane had been in Redemption Creek, explained this with a kind of bureaucratic serenity that made Sadie want to turn the desk over. The problem was that all of Sadie's witnesses from Missouri were in Missouri, and without this declaration her documentation package was incomplete, and without a complete documentation package her case before Judge Calloway was significantly weakened. She went straight to Amos. He listened to the whole thing, seated behind his desk, not moving, with that stillness on him like a held breath. And then he said, "Did Purvis tell you when this requirement was instituted?" "He said it has always been a requirement." "It has not," Amos said flatly. "It was not required 6 months ago. I filed documents through that office myself 6 months ago, and there was no such requirement. Crane has had that change put in place specifically to undermine your case. It is a corrupt use of administrative process, and I cannot prove it today, but I know it." "Then what do I do?" "You write a letter," he said, "to every person in your previous county of residence who has known you for more than a year. You send it by the fastest mail available. You ask them to send back a sworn statement, witnessed by their local land office or justice of the peace, by the 1st of August. And while you are waiting for those statements, I am going to pay a visit to the county seat and have a conversation with the county clerk's supervisor about recent modifications to administrative requirements. Will that work? I do not know yet, he said, but it is the right move and we are going to make it. She sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the desk and looked at him very directly. I need to ask you something. Ask. Are you doing all of this because it is your job, or are you doing it because of what is between us? Because I need to know the difference. I need to know that my case is standing on its own merit and not on your personal interest in the outcome. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him taking the question seriously, not deflecting it. Both, he said at last. The law requires that I protect a citizen under threat of corrupt process. That is my job. That I would move heaven and earth to do so in your particular case. That the personal investment means I will lose sleep over it and wake up early and push harder than I might for someone I did not feel this way about. That is the personal side of it. But the foundation is still the law. Your case is still standing on its own merit. I would not give you a false foundation out of personal feeling. That would be a disservice to you. She believed him. She had come to understand over the preceding months that Amos Easton's relationship with honesty was not a performance. It was a bedrock. Then let us write the letters, she said. They wrote them together that afternoon at his desk. He knew what language would carry weight in an official context. She knew who among her Missouri acquaintances would respond promptly and with the necessary care. They worked for 3 hours, side by side, and she was aware the entire time of the warmth of him next to her and the focused, serious quality of his attention, how he gave everything he was doing his complete concentration. And she thought that a person who gives their full attention to what matters is a rare and extraordinary thing. Amos traveled to the county seat 2 days later and returned with a letter from the county clerk's supervisor, indicating that the new requirement had indeed been added to the registry in a way that was procedurally irregular and would be under review. It was not a rescinding of the requirement, but it was enough to cast doubt on Victor Crane's manipulation, and it was enough to include as documentation before the judge. July moved through its brutal heat. Sadie wrote in the journal about the strange suspended quality of waiting, how time becomes both impossibly slow and terrifyingly fast when you are counting down to something. She wrote about the town, about how it had changed from a temporary circumstance into something that had texture and meaning for her, about how she had started thinking of Clara Hofstede as a friend rather than a landlady, about how Dr. Helen Marsh had invited her to assist with a difficult birth last week, and how the experience of being present for a new life arriving in the world had shaken something loose in her chest in the very best way. She wrote about Amos. She did not try to be circumspect about it anymore. She wrote about him plainly and fully, about how she had started to understand what it meant to trust someone not because you had decided it was safe to trust them, but because the evidence of who they were had accumulated until trust was simply the logical conclusion. About how she looked at his handwriting in the journal and heard his voice in it, a voice she had not known she was memorizing, but apparently had been all along. About how she thought, more and more, that what she had come to Redemption Creek to solve was not actually the most important thing that would happen here. He wrote back about permanence, about how the law was an imperfect instrument, but the intent behind it, the project of making a place safe enough for ordinary people to live ordinary lives without constant fear, was something worth giving your life to. About how he had not, until now, fully understood what was missing from his own ordinary life, the specific warmth and weight of another person who knew you truly. About how the journal, this strange backwards intimacy of paper and ink, had given him something he had not had the vocabulary to ask for. The sworn statements from Missouri arrived on the 28th of July, 3 in total, from Sadie's former school board chairman, from her family's longtime neighbor, and from the minister who had married her in Calvin and who wrote with a ferocity and precision that made Sadie's eyes fill when she read it. a statement that testified to her character, her years in the community, her place in the life of the town, and ended with the line, "Any court that fails to recognize Sadie Barrett as exactly who she is does not deserve to be called a court." She brought the statements to Amos and she said nothing, just put them on his desk, and he read them and looked up at her with something in his expression that was not quite triumph but was close to it, the look of a man who is confirmed in what he already knew. "You are going to win this," he said. "We are going to win this," she said. He shook his head. "No, this is yours. I am just making sure the path is clear." Judge Calloway arrived in Redemption Creek on the 15th of August, on a Thursday, in a buggy that had clearly seen better decades, driven by his ancient and equally weathered clerk. He was a man of perhaps 60, lean and dry as cured leather, with the look of someone who had heard every variety of human foolishness and found very little of it surprising anymore. Victor Crane's lawyers, two men in dusty suits who had come up from San Antonio, presented their case first. They argued that the deed had been improperly transferred because Sadie, as a woman with no established connection to the Texas territory, had neither the knowledge nor the capacity to manage the property as Calvin Barrett had intended. They argued that the family claim took precedence. They argued with the smooth and practiced efficiency of men who were paid very well to argue. Sadie's case was presented by Amos because she could not afford a lawyer and he had prepared it with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and he was a man who knew Judge Calloway and knew what he responded to, which was evidence, plain and documented and undeniable. He presented the will. He presented the deed. He presented Calvin's letters. He presented the sworn statements from Missouri. He presented the documentation from the county seat regarding the administrative irregularity. He presented each item with a brevity and clarity that built, collectively, into an argument so solid it would have taken a wrecking ball to dislodge it. Sadie sat in the chair designated for her, and she kept her hands folded in her lap, and she breathed steadily, and she watched Judge Calloway's face, which gave nothing away. Victor Crane sat across the room and looked at her with a flat and furious patience that said this is not over, even if he said nothing aloud. Judge Calloway deliberated for 2 hours. He came back with a ruling that was as dry and economical as the man himself, about 4 sentences total, in which he affirmed the Barrett deed as legally and unambiguously the property of Sadie Barrett, dismissed the competing claim as having no legal standing, and noted for the record that the administrative requirement added to the land registry during the dispute period showed evidence of irregular application that the county should review with some urgency. It was done. Sadie sat very still for a moment after the judge finished speaking, and then the relief hit her, the enormous, unmanageable weeks of compressed fear relief, and her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through it. And across the room Amos caught her eye and she saw in his face everything he was not saying aloud, the pride in her, the relief for her, the warmth that had been building in those pages for months and was now fully present and fully visible in the open air. Victor Crane left Redemption Creek the following morning. He did not speak to Sadie before he went. He looked at her once from the seat of his horse, with an expression that contained both fury and a kind of grim acceptance, and then he turned the horse and rode south and did not look back. His men had already gone. Sadie stood on the main street and watched him go, and she waited until the dust of his departure had fully settled, and then she turned and walked to the sheriff's office. Amos was at his desk, writing something, his hat off, his dark hair a little disordered from the hat brim the way it always was in the afternoons. He looked up when she came in. She crossed to the desk and she set the journal on it, open to a blank page, and she pushed it toward him, and then she set her pen beside it. "I thought you might want to write something in it," she said, "about how this ended." He looked at the open page and then at her. "What would you like me to write?" he asked. "Whatever is true," she said. He picked up the pen and he wrote, and she stood there and watched him write for the first time, watched his hand move across the page with that careful precision she had come to love in the abstract and was now watching in the particular. And when he finished, he set the pen down and turned the journal so she could read it. He had written, "The story that began badly is ending well. The land belongs to you, and if you will let me, I would very much like to ask you something that has nothing to do with the law." Sadie looked up from the journal. "Ask," she said. "I would like to call on you," he said. "Properly. In the way a person calls on someone they intend to pursue the rest of their life with. I would like to take you to supper and take you walking and be your company in the ordinary daylight way. I would like to stop being the person you write to in a book and start being the person you talk to directly, not instead of the book. I think we should always keep the book, but in addition to it." "You want to court me," Sadie said. "I want to court you," Amos confirmed, with a simple and complete directness that made her chest ache. She picked up the journal and the pen and she wrote one line underneath his, and then she turned it so he could read. She had written, "Yes." The courtship of Sadie Barrett and Amos Easton was conducted with a care and a thoroughness that was entirely in keeping with their characters. He called on her 3 evenings a week, arriving at the Mercantile with his hat in hand, and a propriety that made Clara Hofstede visibly pleased and made Sadie secretly amused, because this was the man who had invaded the most private corners of her inner life and knew her better than anyone alive. And here he was knocking on the front door and asking her permission to walk with her as though they were only just beginning. But she understood why. The journal had given them an extraordinary intimacy very quickly, and the courtship was a way of building the exterior architecture to match the interior, the daylight version of what the lamplight had already built. It was not redundant. It was necessary. They walked in the long summer evenings when the heat softened enough to be bearable. They ate supper at the hotel dining room and at Clara Hofstede's table on Sundays, and Clara fed them both enormous quantities of food and made no secret of her approval. They attended church on Sundays, where Reverend Dade looked at them with a knowing satisfaction that he did not bother to disguise. They rode out to the Barrett land on a Saturday in September, the two of them and Amos's deputy, a young man named Gill who was very carefully not watching them, and Sadie walked her land for the first time since it had been officially and irrevocably confirmed as hers. It was even better than she had imagined from the deed and from Amos's description. The creek in the eastern third ran clear and cold even in the late summer heat, winding through cottonwood trees whose leaves were beginning to turn. The grass was thick and slightly gold at the tips. The land rolled gently toward a rise in the northwest from which you could see a long, clean view of the country in every direction. Sadie stood on that rise and looked out, and Amos came to stand beside her, and he said nothing, because he understood that there were moments that did not need language. After a while she said, "I want to build something here." "Yes," he said. "A house," she said. "A real house. Not just a structure, a house that is intended for a life." "I know a good builder," he said. "His name is Thompson. He built the schoolhouse and the church. He does solid work." She turned to look at him then, and they were standing very close in the September afternoon, and she could see the fine lines at the corners of his dark eyes and the particular quietness of him that she had come to understand was not reserve but depth. A man who has a great deal of interior life and does not feel the need to project it outward. She said, "I do not want to build a house alone." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said with a quiet and absolute certainty, "You will not." He asked her to marry him in October, on an evening when the first chill of autumn had come into the air, and they were sitting on the small porch of the Mercantile watching the stars come out over the Texas plain. He did not make a production of it. He said, "Sadie, I would like to marry you. I would like to spend the rest of my life with you. I would like to build that house on your land and make a life in it with you that is nothing like what either of us has been through, that is its own thing entirely, something good. Will you have me?" She turned to look at him, and the stars were coming out behind him one by one, and she said, "Yes, I will have you. I will very gladly have you." He reached across and took her hand and held it, and they sat like that while the stars filled in, and neither of them said anything else for a long time because nothing else needed to be said. They were married on the first Saturday of November 1882 in the little church in Redemption Creek, with Reverend Dade presiding and Clara Hofstede weeping magnificently in the front pew, and Ezra Poole laughing his great raftering laugh when Amos kissed his bride, and Dr. Helen Marsh looking on with the expression of someone who has delivered enough life into the world to know what good looks like when it stands in front of her. Sadie wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her and pressed immaculately by Clara, a deep blue the color of a winter evening, and she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Amos had found somewhere and presented to her that morning outside her door with a look of such transparent tenderness that she had stood there blinking at them for a full 30 seconds before she could collect herself. The journal sat on the desk in what would become their home, because they did not abandon it after the wedding. It would have felt like abandoning something sacred. Instead, they continued to use it, writing in it on the evenings when the things they wanted to say required the particular kind of honesty that came more easily through the page than through the voice. It became a living document of their life, of what they were building together day by day in the red rock and wide sky country of Redemption Creek. Construction on the house on the Barrett land began in the spring of 1883. Thompson, the builder Amos had recommended, was indeed excellent, a meticulous man who asked specific questions and listened to the answers and built exactly what was asked for rather than what he assumed people wanted. Sadie had very particular ideas about the house. She wanted light, large windows on the south and east sides that would fill the rooms with morning sun. She wanted a porch that wrapped around the south side so that you could sit on it in the evenings and watch the light change over the land. She wanted a room in the northwest corner that would be a study with bookshelves, because she had not stopped being a woman who believed that words were the most powerful tools available to a person, and she intended to have them around her. Amos added one request of his own. He wanted a proper kitchen, large and practical, with a good wood stove, because he had turned out, to Sadie's surprised delight, to be an extremely competent cook, a skill he had acquired during the years of itinerant work across the territory and had never previously had occasion to deploy in a domestic context. The revelation of this had been one of the great pleasant surprises of the early weeks of their marriage, coming home to the rented rooms above the mercantile, which they had occupied while the land dispute was resolving and the house was being planned, to find that supper was not only prepared but genuinely excellent. They moved into the house in July of 1883, on a Saturday, with half the town helping them carry things in, and Clara Hofstede organizing the kitchen with the efficient authority of a general deploying troops. By the time the sun went down, the house was full of the warm noise of friends and the smell of food and the particular golden quality of a life beginning, and Sadie stood in the middle of the front room and looked at the large south-facing windows and the beginning of bookshelves along the north wall, and the man across the room who was listening to something Ezra Poole was telling him and laughing with his full face, not his guarded face but his real face, the one she knew from the evenings and the journal and the quiet mornings, and she thought, with a completeness and a certainty that settled into her like coming to rest after a very long journey, this is the thing. This is what it was all leading toward. Their first child, a boy they named Calvin James Easton, arrived in April of 1884, and the naming of him was its own long conversation in the journal, because Sadie wanted to honor the man who had been her first husband and her friend, and Amos had said, without hesitation, that he thought it was right and good to do so, that carrying a name forward was not a diminishment of the present but a recognition that the past shaped everything and deserved acknowledgement. Calvin James Easton arrived with a great deal of noise, an opinion at 6 in the morning on a bright April day, delivered by Dr. Helen Marsh, who was absolutely unruffled by any of it, and Amos sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands for the hour and a half of the most difficult part, and then came into the room when Helen called for him, and held his son, and looked at Sadie with an expression she had never seen on him before, something completely undone. All the careful stillness dissolved into something open and raw and overwhelmed. And she reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt, in that moment, the full staggering weight of all of it, the grief and the fear and the long months of letters in the dark, and the trust that had been built one careful page at a time leading here, to this room, this man, this child. She wrote about it in the journal that evening, with Calvin James asleep in the wooden cradle that Ezra Poole had made for them, his enormous hands capable of the most surprising delicacy when given the right task. She wrote about what it felt like to have made something entirely new in the world, something that had not existed before and was now entirely itself. And Amos read it over her shoulder, and he took the pen from her hand gently and wrote underneath, "I did not understand before today what it meant to have something to protect. I had the law and the county and the town, all of which I care about genuinely. But this is something else entirely. This is the thing itself." Redemption Creek grew in those years. The railroad came through in 1885, 3 miles south of town, and with it came new families and new businesses and a pace of change that was sometimes exhilarating and sometimes disorienting, as all such changes are. Amos was re-elected sheriff in 1886 with near-unanimous support from a town that had watched him do the job for nearly a decade and had no complaints worth mentioning. He ran his office with the same patient thoroughness he had always brought to it, and the county was, by any reasonable measure, as well-ordered and as safe as a Texas county in the 1880s could reasonably be expected to be. Sadie opened a school. It was the logical and inevitable conclusion of everything she was, and the town needed one desperately, the existing school arrangement having been an informal and inadequate affair run out of the church on weekday mornings by Reverend Dade, who was willing but exhausted. She proposed a proper school to the town council in 1885, presented a curriculum, a budget, and a plan for funding with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been arguing for institutional support for education since her days on the Missouri School Board, and the town council, somewhat dazed by the thoroughness of the presentation, approved it unanimously. The Redemption Creek School opened in September of 1886 with 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, in a building that Thompson had constructed with the same meticulous care he had brought to everything, with large windows for light and a proper blackboard and enough desks for 30, because Sadie had specified the extra desks on the grounds that growing a town means growing a school. She taught 6 days a week with an energy and a passion for the work that the students found either inspiring or terrifying, depending on their temperament, and she was by any measure one of the finest teachers Redemption Creek had ever had, which was also the finest it had ever had in any category because Sadie Barrett set a very high bar. She was Sadie Easton now, of course. She had been Sadie Easton for 3 years. But the name Barrett she kept in the school and on the deed, not to make a point, but because the land that bore that name was Calvin's legacy, and she believed in honoring legacies plainly. Amos had never once suggested otherwise. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Sadie's mother, arrived in the winter of 1887, during a snowstorm that swept down from the north with startling ferocity, and had Amos deeply anxious and Dr. Helen Marsh entirely composed, and Sadie very firmly in charge of her own experience, which was how she operated in all things. Margaret arrived in the middle of the storm with the weather howling outside and the wood stove burning high in the bedroom, and she arrived, like her brother before her, with a great deal of noise and personal conviction. Amos held Margaret Eleanor Easton for the first time and said, very quietly into the top of her small head, "You are going to be formidable," Sadie, from the pillow, said. "She gets that from me." "I know," Amos said, smiling. "I would not have it any other way." The journal was by this point in its third volume, the first having filled up completely and the second not far behind it. They still wrote in it, though the rhythm had shifted with the fullness of daily life, the children and the school and the ranch, because they had put cattle on the land in 1885, and it required management, and the law and all its daily demands. Sometimes a week would go by without an entry, and then Sadie would sit down one evening when the children were asleep and write something true and private, and Amos would read it and write back, and the thread between them that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances, through the invasion of her privacy and the unexpected grace of his response, remained alive and continuous and theirs. They sat together one October evening in 1888, on the south porch of the house they had built on the land they had fought for, with the sky going violet and orange behind the western hills, and the smell of the late-season grass on the air, and Calvin James, now 4 years old, asleep inside with his sister, and the journal on the small table between them. The lamp was lit because the evenings were shortening, and its warm circle surrounded them against the early dark. Amos reached across and opened the journal to a random page, one of the early entries, and read it quietly. She watched him read, watched the way his expression shifted as the words reached him, recognition and something tender. "Do you remember this?" he said, turning the journal so she could see. It was one of the very first entries she had written in Redemption Creek about being 26 and alone and afraid. She read it and nodded. "It is very strange," she said, "to read your own fear from the outside. It looks so large on the page. I was so afraid." "You were brave," he said. "You were afraid and you were brave simultaneously. That is the definition of courage as far as I understand it." "You wrote back to me," she said. "That is the thing I have thought about most over all these years. Not that you found it because that was chance, but that you wrote back. You could have closed the book and returned it without a word written in it, and nobody would have known, but you wrote back." He was quiet for a moment. The autumn wind moved through the grass. "I wrote back," he said, "because someone was speaking honestly into the dark and it felt wrong to leave that unanswered. And because I recognized something in what you wrote, something I had been carrying myself without quite knowing how to name it. You named it. You named the loneliness and the fear and the need for something real. And I thought, if I can answer this, if I can write back to this and have it land somewhere useful, I should do it." "It landed," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." She reached over and put her hand over his, where it rested on the journal. They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, thick and magnificent over the Texas plain, the same stars that had been coming out over this land since long before either of them was born, and would continue coming out long after them, indifferent and luminous and wonderful. Inside the house, Calvin James Easton, 4 years old and the image of his father except for his mother's dark eyes, slept with his fists curled under his chin, and his small chest rising and falling with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never had reason to doubt that the world is fundamentally all right. And Margaret Eleanor Easton, 13 months old and already, as her father had predicted, formidable, slept in the cradle Ezra Poole had made, her small brow slightly furrowed even in sleep, as though she was already solving a problem that the rest of the world had not yet identified. Dr. Helen Marsh had settled permanently into Redemption Creek, and had, in the summer of 1886, married a widowed rancher named Daniel Foster, who was steady and kind, and who looked at her with the specific admiration of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for. She delivered all of the Easton children and maintained a warm friendship with Sadie that was one of the organizing relationships of both their lives. Clara Hofstede had not remarried and did not intend to. She said so plainly when anyone raised the subject. But she had expanded the mercantile significantly, and was the most prosperous independent businesswoman in the county, and entirely at peace with her own life, which she ran with efficiency and warmth and on her own thoroughly capable terms. Ezra Poole had trained 2 apprentices, and the blacksmith shop had grown into a proper ironworks that supplied not only Redemption Creek but 3 neighboring towns, and his laugh still shook the rafters on any occasion that required laughing. Reverend Dade had, in his own gentle and inexorable way, trained a young minister named Thomas Reed to take over the church, and had retired into a quiet house at the edge of town, where he read and sat on his porch, and received visitors with a welcome that made every caller feel they were the most important person who had come to see him that day, which was simply how he experienced people. Gil, Amos's deputy, had become a deputy of some years' experience by now, and was in the process of applying for a sheriff's appointment in the next county over, which Amos had supported with a letter of recommendation of such thorough and genuine praise that it had apparently left the appointment board in no doubt whatsoever. Redemption Creek was not a perfect town. No town in the world is perfect, and the 1880s were a complicated and often difficult time in Texas, as they were across the whole of the West, where the promises of the frontier were being tested against the realities of who was welcome to claim them and who was not, and Amos did not look away from those complications. He dealt with the disputes and the injustices that came through his office with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, and he was not always popular for it, because the right thing and the popular thing are not always the same, and a good lawman knows the difference and chooses accordingly. Sadie in her school taught every child who came through her door as though they were equally capable of extraordinary things, because she believed they were, and the graduated students of the Redemption Creek School were distinguishable from students elsewhere in the region by a particular quality of clear and confident thought that their teacher had refused to let them believe was beyond them. These were the things they built. Together and separately and together again, the way lives are actually built, not in one clean arc but in the daily accumulation of choices and care, and the small sustained effort of being, on ordinary Tuesdays and difficult Novembers alike, the people they had decided to be. The journal was full by the spring of 1889. Not just the 2nd volume, but the 3rd, completely full, every page written on front and back in the 2 distinct handwritings that had been in conversation for 7 years, the cramped, urgent sentences of a woman learning that she could trust her own voice, and the measured, careful lines of a man who had learned, through the particular alchemy of paper and honesty, how to say the things that mattered. Sadie set the completed 3rd journal on the shelf in the study, beside the 1st and 2nd volumes. She stood there a moment looking at them. Amos came to stand beside her. "We should start a new one," he said. "We should," she agreed. She had a blank journal already, because she had known the 3rd volume was nearly full, and she had purchased a new one at the Mercantile when she ordered supplies for the school. She took it from the desk and set it beside the lamp, and she opened it to the 1st page, and she picked up her pen. She thought for a moment about what to write, about where to begin the new volume, what to say at the start of something that would go on for however many years they were given. In this house, on this land, in this town they had both come to, in their separate difficulties, and had made into the place where their lives actually happened. She wrote, "This is the 4th volume of a conversation that began in the strangest possible way and has turned out to be the organizing fact of my life. I am 29 years old and I am not afraid. I have 2 children who are extraordinary. I have a husband who found my secrets and answered them with his own. I have land and a home and a school and friends who have become family. The troubles I wrote into the 1st pages of the 1st volume have been resolved. Not perfectly, because nothing is ever resolved perfectly, but truly. I am happy. I am genuinely, specifically, all the way down happy, in a way that I know is real because I know now what the false versions feel like. I wanted to write that at the beginning of this new volume so that it exists on paper, witnessed and permanent, because my mother was right that the page holds what you cannot say aloud. And what I cannot say aloud, not without crying in a way that would alarm the children, is how grateful I am for all of it. For the hard parts too. For the journal and the man who read it and the town and the years and the life that turned out to be so much larger and richer than the one I arrived here expecting. She passed the pen to Amos. He took it and he read what she had written, and he sat for a long moment. Then he bent over the new volume and he wrote, in the careful hand she had loved for 7 years, in the voice that was entirely his own, that she knew as well as she knew her own heartbeat. My turn. 7 years ago I found a journal on the floor of a corridor, and I read something that was not intended for my eyes, and I made a choice that I was not entirely certain was the right one, to answer it rather than return it in silence. I have thought about that choice many times in the years since. I have thought about how different everything would be if I had put the book back without a word. I think about it the way you think about narrow escapes, with a cold and retrospective gratitude, because this is the life I would have missed. This woman beside me who is stronger than anyone I have ever known, and who has been kind enough to let me know her fully. These children who are themselves entirely, and are the greatest evidence I have for the argument that the world is worth the trouble. This town and this work and this house with the south-facing windows she specified, because she wanted morning light. I am 40 years old and I have no complaints that matter. I have everything. I wanted to write that too, in case she did not know. Sadie read it over his shoulder, and she put her arm around him, and he turned his head and kissed her temple. And outside the south-facing windows the Texas spring was doing what it did every year, coming back with total conviction, the grass green and the sky enormous, and the light falling clean and gold across the land that had started all of this, the land that Calvin Barrett had loved and left her, the land that had brought her to this town and this man and this life that was hers now. Completely and irrevocably hers, and more than she had thought possible in those first frightened weeks when she had written her troubles into a journal and tucked it under a loose floorboard and gone out into the world every morning pretending not to be afraid. She was not pretending anymore. She turned the page and kept writing. The journal kept going, and so did they. And in the evenings, when the school was quiet and the cattle were settled and the children were asleep, and the stars were coming out over the Texas plain in their old and luminous abundance, the lamp burned on the study desk and the pages filled, and the two handwritings ran on side by side, different in character but entirely in harmony, the way two people who have learned the full truth of each other and chosen to stay are always in harmony, not perfect, not without friction or difficulty, but genuine all the way through, the real thing, the solid and enduring and quietly magnificent real thing. The troubles that Sadie Barrett had once written into those pages were not gone. The world did not eliminate trouble, but they had been answered, everyone, in ways she could not have imagined when she had first set pen to paper in a rented room above a Texas mercantile, alone and afraid, and not yet knowing that the most important correspondence of her life had already begun. It had begun the moment the journal fell open on the corridor floor. It had been built, one careful entry at a time, by a woman who had nothing left but honesty and a man who had the wisdom to recognize what honesty was worth. And it had become, in the end, everything.